how do you build a multiracial radical movement in an area where the crux of the work class is mostly Black, and you have a bastion of white supremacy?
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
As a Union Talk radio show host, I'm all the time getting asked for kind of a historical context, and every time I'm asked for that, I always reference Hammer and Hoe. And so the author of that work is Dr. Robin Kelley. So I thought, who better to talk to about this than him? So Dr. Kelley, thank you so much for being willing to talk to us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So Dr. Kelley, I think the first thing that would be, I think the audience would want to know is the Hammer and Hoe is the history of the Alabama Communist Party during the Depression era. What made you interested in studying like such a ostensibly niche topic? What was it that the Alabama Communist Party, of all things, made you want to study them?
That's a great question, because my dissertation advisor asked the same question. In fact, I think he used the term niche topic. And I think his joke was actually more of disparaging my project was, you have to write a dissertation more than 50 pages. My dissertation, by the way, was about 698 pages. And my road to this project really was through the political work I was doing back in the 1980s. I mean, my dissertation was written in 87. The book came out, revised version, in 1990, so it's really 30 years. And it was a time when, in the late 80s, when a lot of us were involved in left organizing. In my case, I was in Los Angeles, involved with the anti-apartheid movement, and I was actually writing about South Africa. My field was African history. And so I was looking at the left in South Africa and its history, and it dawned on me after I'd read this magnificent book it's basically Hosea Hudson's life story put together by the great historian Nell Painter, which is basically his memoir, oral memoir of Hosea Hudson. Hosea Hudson was a leading communist in Alabama at the time, and was still alive, living in Gainesville, Florida. And it was reading that book and reading about the Sharecroppers Union that made me think, the stuff I'm doing in South Africa sounds very similar. So my proposal at the time was to look at South Africa and the US South and the left. The South African government helped me decide to work in Alabama because in 1986, I wasn't getting into the country. I'll never forget the day I went to the South African consulate, with my visa application, and they'd see me there protesting, and the woman behind the glass was like just laughing at me. Like, why would you even think about like applying to go there? So that took the South Africa part out of it temporarily. But what it did was it left me with Alabama. And I was going to look at the whole South, but Alabama was really the heart of the party's work, precisely because they were very strong in the Birmingham, Bessemer area. Mm-hmm. They wanted to build an industrial, unionized, class movement. And it's funny because they didn't think they would be as successful as they were in the rural areas, places like Tallapoosa County, Montgomery County, Lowndes County. But instead, they knew Birmingham, Bessemer area was the place. So I basically followed the documents. I went, did a lot of, research, talked to a lot of people, and put together this book. And again, the context is important because when I was writing it, it was on the verge of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet experiment, Eastern Bloc countries. It was at a moment when we had a decade of, Reaganism and Bushism, which is really, Reagan begins the decade with this first attack on the Air Traffic Controllers Union. I mean, it's just the anti-unionism, especially a union that actually endorsed Reagan, which is kind of an amazing thing. So this was a moment when many of us were doing this kind of work, trying to, labor with labor. And the Communist Party in Alabama just seemed like a great place to study the questions. And specifically, the question that I was posing was, how do you build a multiracial radical movement that in an area where the crux of the work class is mostly Black, and you have a bastion of white supremacy? Like, how do you do that? And the thing that I have to say I learned, which for a lot of people of my generation and after was pretty shocking, is how successful the party was. And not just the party, but all the other organizations it had a relationship with, whether it's the union movement, International Labor Defense, whether it's looking at the Sharecroppers Union, that they really did do a great job. And the amazing thing is, despite being a kind of bastion of white supremacy, which I would say all of America is, you had some amazing white working class radicals who came out, risked their lives, lost their lives in some cases, to fight on behalf of the class, of the working class. And that's, to me, a lesson that we have to continue to go back to always, because there's a sense of almost, not, I wouldn't say complacency, but sort of dread that there's no possible way that you can build a multiracial movement again, that those days are over, and they were never really that powerful anyway. But I think that the party, the story of Alabama is a story of not just resilience, but of militancy. And it's a reminder, and something I've always argued, that people are too quick to write off the South. I mean, when I remember when the last president was elected, and all my colleagues here at UCLA, and people in LA were all like self-congratulatory about, oh, well, California didn't go for Trump, and we're so progressive, though we have the largest prison population in the country, but we're so progressive, and we're the left coast, and they wrote off the South. And I'm like, you don't understand that the South has always been the Achilles heel for American capitalism. I mean, when you really look at it, from Reconstruction on down, this is where movements would take place. And sure enough, it's like the first place where Amazon is going to finally have, the corporation is going to have to deal with a union, a real union, is going to be in Alabama.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's, you said a few things there that the timing of the writing of your book, you started doing the writing in right after the fall of right after the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, that, today writing this book there's certainly a resurgence of kind of the anti-capitalist left. And so it wouldn't be, somebody writing a history of the Alabama Communist Party today, like, it wouldn't really get, it wouldn't be that abnormal, so to speak, but writing, publishing it in what was it, the late 90s or early 2000s, I could imagine that you got a couple of looks about that.
No, but it's not 1990, which is also strange. I mean, it came out in 1990, which is exactly, but you're right. I mean, you think about 89, 90, 91. This is where this is basically the fall of the Eastern Bloc, but you're right. It's also
the end of history.
Yeah, the so-called end of history, exactly. Where to talk about communism was just like, people look at you funny. But to be truthful, and this is also the case in Birmingham in that period of time, because I have a lot of friends and comrades who were there in the late 80s. Believe it or not, there was a kind of resurgence of the left beginning late 70s, early 80s. And it was after the Greensboro massacre, for example, where four members of the Communist Workers' Party and then one person who wasn't a member but was very close to the party, was shot and killed by the Klan and by Nazis. And that didn't actually dampen rather the left. It actually led to even more formation. So that for those of us who are inside that world, if I gave you the list of all the communist, Marxist-Leninist, Trotskyists, Marxist-Leninist, Maoist organizations that emerged, I'd be here all day.
Right. There's
so many. It just sort of took off. It wasn't a mass movement, but just to say that inside those circles, even if we saw the writing on the wall, even if we knew that the Soviet experiment, because none of us was really sort of supporting the Soviet experiment. It wasn't really, it was no longer considered like a progressive move, but we did believe that socialism was still possible in the United States, and that shaped it.
That's interesting that you noted that there was a massacre that kind of kicked off a mini left resurgence during the time that you were writing this book, because as I read the history in your book, a similar thing happened with the strength of the Alabama Communist Party, because which is the Scottsboro Boys, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I think a lot of folks know some about the story of the Scottsboro Boys, but they don't know how the Communist Party was involved, which they were, really the only ones kind of pushing it at the time. Some of the more mainstream liberal type organizations, the NAACP, they weren't really touching it. Talk to us about the Scottsboro Boys and how it played a similar role in sparking a real, really sparking the movement for an anti-capitalist left in working class Alabama.
Right. No, it's a great question. And I have to give credit to Dan Carter, because Dan Carter wrote the book on the Scottsboro case, An American Tragedy. And in my reading as a graduate student trying to figure out what to do, reading that book, which does deal with the Communist Party as well, also inspired me. And he became a colleague of mine at Emory University. So Scottsboro is interesting because what I do in the book is I look at it from the vantage point of Alabama organizers. We think of Scottsboro strictly as an international cause célèbre, but basically the story is these 9 young men, they didn't all know each other either, were, a lot of them were from Tennessee, riding the rails, trying to look for jobs. And like everyone in those days, just jumping in a boxcar was a way to get around. So they happened to be there. They end up getting in a fight with some white dudes, and then the cops stop in Paint Rock, Alabama, and they stop the train. When they hear about the complaint about the fight, they start arresting people, and they discover 2 white women who are also riding rails, have no relationship to these men at all. And again, this is a very important lesson in terms of the kind of racial and sexual and gender politics that we dealt with then, and we still do it today. In order for these young women to try to get out of being arrested for solicitation, for whatever it is, just being women alone means that you're subject to police power. They said, well, these guys raped us, these 9 young, boys, some were boys, the youngest was 13, and some were like young teenagers, older teenagers. So of course this never happened. One of the victims, I say victims, but one of the people who was accused of Ruby Bates actually recanted testimony. Now, why did this happen? And this is where the Communist Party comes in. Cases like these were a dime a dozen, where some black man or black men are being accused of a crime. If they're not lynched, the criminal justice system picks them up and they will be either legally lynched in the sense that they might get the death penalty or go to jail forever. This happens all the time. The Communist Party actually had something that a lot of progressive organizations didn't have, a newspaper, the Southern Worker. They had editors, they had organizers. They'd been fighting on behalf of Black rights. In Alabama, they were involved in a Black girl who was raped by a white man, trying to get justice for her. There were all these other cases. In fact, there's a whole bunch of cases in Alabama in 1930 involving a guy named Tom Robertson, who was lynched because he had if I remember correctly, he had a fight over a car battery or some kind of battery. And the lynchings in Alabama and throughout the South led to a conference that the Communist Party held in Tennessee, in Chattanooga, I believe. And in that conference, they said, look, we need to pay attention to lynching. We need to make this one of our agenda items. That's the context in which the Scottsboro defendants are arrested and they become a case. So the party then jumped on it. The NAACP sent their attorneys, but they're not that interested. The party sent an attorney to defend these people. But what they did was they developed a strategy, which they'd already developed before through the International Labor Defense, and that is a strategy of putting injustice before the court of popular opinion. So the idea was to tell the world the story of the Scottsboro case, to get petitions everywhere, to show photographs, to get stories in the press in every single country. And so they took a local story and made it an international one, to the point where you had demonstrations in Tokyo, free the Scottsboro boys, demonstrations in Moscow, demonstrations in Cape Town, South Africa. And that tragedy and their fight to try to free them became a mobilizing tool, or not, I shouldn't say tool, because that makes it seem like it's deliberate, but it became a point of mobilization for African Americans who had no interest necessarily in the left, but saw an organization fighting on behalf of the rights of Black people within a criminal justice system that they knew was unjust in the first place. And that really changed the character of what the party was doing. And a lot of people joined because of that. It's a very similar story. It's like, with Emmett Till. The murder of Emmett Till did more to convince a lot of Black people to join the civil rights movement, later SNCC, SCLC, than say Brown versus the Board of Education. Because Emmett Till was like, they could see themselves. Right. Just like a lot of African Americans could see themselves suddenly caught up in some kind of dragnet and being accused of something they didn't do. And it was a tragedy in terms of how many people end up staying in jail longer than they needed to, which is one day more. But the fact is that for the Communist Party and for the left generally, for the CP left, the Scottsboro case became that sort of rallying cry to build a movement that was not just about class struggle in the formal sense, but about racial justice.
Right. And that, my understanding of the way that you presented is that and cases like that really did a lot to convince working class Black folks in Alabama that like the left is kind of where I'm going to get help to make my life better. And that's, if you could talk a little bit about kind of the makeup of the party, because I think that's one of the most interesting things about the Alabama Communist Party is that, when you think of communists in the 20th century in America, you might imagine kind of somebody like me, like a yuppie, like some white college educated yuppie. But that was not at all the party in Alabama. So what was up with that?
Right. No, it's a very, very good point. This was a working class, mostly Black organization. And by working class, and let's just focus on sort of the two regions. One is the kind of Birmingham, Bessemer region, and then the rural areas of Montgomery. But Birmingham, Bessemer, you're talking about steel workers, iron ore workers, miners. Hold on one second. Can you close the door, please? I can't hear. Sorry about that. Problem with pandemics, you have to do these things from home.
No worries at all.
Okay, so imagine working class. Many of the folks, not all, but couldn't read or write or had maybe second or third grade education. They were members of gospel quartets. Many were devout Christians. The Bible became a very important source for them in terms of kind of justifying the work that they're doing, explaining. there was also, so you have this black working class kind of base. And in fact, at one point, the Communist Party's membership was larger than NAACP in Birmingham, like much larger. And so it was, I wouldn't call it a mass organization, but it did have significant numbers. So there's that. But then also you have white working class men and women as well as a couple of outliers. I mean, there was a woman named Jane Speed who came from money. And her mother also came. They were very wealthy. The family happened to be in Vienna, I think, under fascism, and saw a lot. I mean, and then ended up coming back to Alabama and then joining the Communist Party. And so she opened up a bookstore in Birmingham, a left-wing bookstore in Birmingham, Alabama in like 1939. I mean, who does that, right?
Right.
And so it's an interesting group. And because it was predominantly Black with white members, there was a way in which African Americans were pushed into leadership positions within the party. So imagine what it meant to be in a space where Black working class men and women, often with very little formal education, could actually critique a white comrade who you typically can't even be in the same classroom with because of segregation, critique them and say, you know what, your positions are wrong and this is what we need to do. I mean, it was the kind of thing where the social relationships were just unheard of at the time. And it angered a lot of the white working class men and women, but they stuck with it. Many of them did. And learn and develop social relationships that I would argue were stronger and more genuine than even some of the left formations in places like Chicago, in LA, and New York, and Philadelphia. You know?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you touched a little bit on the religiosity of these communities. You know, there are so many kind of narratives that your book really attacks kind of head on. And another one of them is that, you know, communism is anti-Christian and anti-religion. And certainly there are, you know, flavors of it that are, and Marx was not a theist,
Right.
and he did not believe that people should be, but, basically everybody in the party in Alabama was. What was that kind of interplay there between the, you know, you said that they would use, churches for party meetings.
Right, exactly. Party meetings and union meetings, some churches, because of course there were churches in the payroll of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, some ministers who got money basically to be union busters, which goes to show you there's a long history of Black elite complicity in undermining working class movements. But for the most part, the gospel quartets for some Black male members, like I think it was Henry O. Mayfield and Hosea Hudson, that was a circuit of singers that was a recruiting tool for the Communist Party. No one ever think that, right?
Wow. But I've always wanted to be in a gospel quartet, so maybe this is the way in.
I know it shocked me, but you know, I spent a lot of time with Hosea Hudson telling me these stories. But also, the Bible became very important because, and you know, it was a genuine use of the Bible and understanding of it. What we would think of today as liberation theology, but they weren't thinking in those terms, because the Bible was the text that people knew. And, you know, and there was so much in their biblical interpretation that justified the work they were doing about the least of these, you know, and what does it mean to be impoverished, and it's a sin to have money and just basically hold on to it. So this is the kind of stuff that drew people to the party without it necessarily becoming a trick. You know, they weren't trying to convince people. But the other part of this story too is that among the white, I wouldn't say elite, but the more educated members of the party were committed, especially during the Popular Front. Many were Jewish, and many were in fact dealing with a Jewish community that in some cases was split, very anti-communist, on the one hand, but also very sympathetic, depending, because Alabama has a long history of a Jewish community there. And so that was also an issue or a factor in terms of who became the central figures. People like Joseph Gelders, for example, and his daughter Marge Gelders were among those. And so, this is not to say that there wasn't an interest in kind of Marxism or an interest in understanding the rest of the world beyond a kind of biblical framework. In fact, there was political education that took place. I
remember one of the things that you said in the book was that when I think it was Hosea Hudson was sent to New York for that political education for those classes by the party, that he came back and something like he had never felt more kind of dignified, more like a man, and that's really amazing, and that's awesome. Yeah,
well, what's great, he went to New York, but he also went to the Soviet Union.
Right.
Which is the other thing. So he went, Henry O. Mayfield went, and they studied at a school, basically the Lenin School. Then there was also another school called the University of Toilers of the East, Kutba. So imagine, just think about what it means to grow up in Georgia or Alabama, or to be like Al Murphy, for example, is another one, who they know the South, they know churches, they know unions. They have spent some time in grade school, usually a segregated schoolhouse where they would only be in school for maybe a few months out of the year because they'd be kids of sharecroppers. And then suddenly, free passage to the USSR to go to Moscow. Right. And you've never been outside. I mean, some of those cats never been outside of the state of Alabama. So that was something that was extraordinary. And what's interesting is that some of them went there without basic literacy skills. So it wasn't like they were studying, Lenin and Marxist selected works. They were just learning to read and write, and in circles with people from all over the globe, from different levels of political education. And they did come back really emboldened in terms of their ability to organize, in terms of knowledge of the world. And then also the other source of education was the fact that there's a press. So the Southern Worker was published, sharecroppers and workers would write letters to the Southern Worker, which would be published. They read the Daily Worker. They read the Labor Defender, which was the International Labor Defense Journal. They read the Negro Worker, which was an international publication that circulated among some of the Alabama comrades that told stories about struggles in South Africa and Kenya, in Australia, places like that. It was an amazing thing. And so what I do talk about in the book is that a lot of the women, young girls in particular, were the ones who usually had more formal education, and they tend to be literate, in part because the avenues of, say, working in a steel mill wasn't open to them. So for girls, Black girls growing up in Alabama, they call it the farmer's daughter effect. You had to get as much education as possible to be a teacher or a social worker. So they would be reading out loud to whole groups of working people under a shady tree or in a park, just reading from pages of the Southern Worker. And that's how people who couldn't read got the information. So imagine what it meant. It meant that, and this is one of my favorite stories, that when Ernst Thälmann, who was a German communist, was thrown in prison under Hitler, and this is before the real takeoff of the Third Reich, there was a whole campaign to free him. So you have these African Americans never left Alabama, young people putting out posters and leaflets throughout Tallapoosa County saying, free Ernst Thälmann. And the owners of the plantation like, who is this? What are you doing? And so when they say that there was a conspiracy and there were Reds, it's kind of true.
Yeah.
They just happen to be Black.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, whenever during the civil rights movement, one of the things that you'll see from some of the white reactionaries is like race mixing is communism, and it's like, well, I mean, there's
some truth to that.
yeah, I mean, you're not completely wrong.
Hey,
But
Jacob,
yes.
Guys,
we got a couple of questions coming in.
Yeah, we've got a couple
Okay.
questions. I've seen the YouTube chat, and I'm working on incorporating them in as I've got those in my head, David. I
Okay.
appreciate it. But yeah, you said that there's a lot of this international cooperation in the party on the part of these folks who. A phrase that I use is I ain't never been nowhere. I'm just some, guy who grew up in rural Alabama, ain't never been nowhere. And these folks, they ain't never been nowhere. And now they're going internationally and learning all of these things. And there's a lot they're talking about freeing German communists from, Nazi oppression kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of really interesting autonomy that the Alabama Communist Party had that I'd like for you to talk about some, because there were a lot of international drama. It's more important than that, but there was a lot of international conflicts within the international communist movement that the Alabama communists were like, whatever, we'll take the party line, but it doesn't really matter to us. They were really kind of singularly focused on, not singularly, but they were really focused on how do I make my life better?
Right. That is absolutely true, because you cannot peg the different machinations of the Communist International to what was happening on the ground. So to just give you three quick examples, one, the Communist Party's position in 1928 was that Black people in the Black Belt counties of the South have a right to self-determination, a right to succeed from the Union if they choose to and have their own nation. Well, I mean, it was an empowering idea, but it wasn't like folks who were trying to figure out how to not be evicted from their house, or who needed coal because they had burned all the firewood they had just to keep warm. They weren't thinking about that. They were thinking about what to do next. And so they developed all these strategies that were so local, like using penny postcards to send to social workers to say, if you take the workers' flour and stuff, we're after you. We're going to expose you. In fact, we know that you're sleeping with the principal of the school, and we're going to expose that information. That's the strategy. Strategies also involve things like being really underground, using jumper cables to get people's lights back on without being detected. But in terms of the international,
that was really cool.
But there was one change. Well, another change I should mention is that when you had the Nazi-Soviet pact and the Communist Party went from being like strongly, anti-fascist to then focusing on supporting the Soviets' agreement with the Nazis in 1939, which was a bad decision, but was meant to be a kind of stopgap measure to try to keep the Germans from invading Russia. Whatever the case may be in terms of how one reads it, the fact of the matter is that it didn't matter to people on the ground. That wasn't their fight. But the one place where it did matter internationally was in 1935 when the Communist International decided they're going to, open up the Popular Front idea so that they could build alliances with liberals. And this is where in Alabama, it was a little bit different in that the party leadership did try hard to do just that, to build alliances with white liberals in the South, often at the expense of the working class struggles, not so much the expense of the union, because they were kind of underground, participating in the union, but really at the expense of the unemployed, expense of all those kind of grassroots struggles. And the idea was, if we can just get a broader base, then we'll be stronger. But the problem is that in a place like Alabama, like Georgia, like Louisiana, Mississippi, to be a liberal in the South, to be a white liberal was to be less radical than some of the white working class comrades. Liberals were devoted to Jim Crow, were committed to the status quo. Liberals were like Hugo Black, who was a Supreme Court justice, but also started out in the Klan. That's what liberals look like. So what they end up doing is cutting some of their ties and undermining the sort of working class foundation that they had in trying to chase down liberals that they could never win. And instead, what they did get were really amazing radical intellectuals like Joseph Gelders, like people, I could say this now, like Rosa Parks, who wasn't a member of the party, but she was very close to those folks. Sally Davis, who's the mother of Angela Davis. There's a lot of interesting people who are close to the party, if not members.
Right. That's and so there was a lot of focus on kind of what can make my life better, what's happening on the ground, and how can we use the party to make our lives better. And so what were and one of those ways that they saw was the labor movement. And I think this will be a good way to bring us into what's happening today. But what were the Alabama Communist Party's connections to the labor movement, and how did they use the labor movement for kind of for their own ends, and how did they work with the labor movement? What was the intersection there of the labor movement and the party in Alabama?
Right. Well, to answer the question, how did they use the movement for their own ends? Their ends were simple: to build a strong labor movement.
Right.
And so that's really, that's just something, a point of clarity for your listeners, because
I appreciate that. That was not good wording on my part.
But it's exactly. I'm glad you said it that way, because actually that is how we think often of it, and I think it's important to frame it that way because it is true that what they want to do is build a strong labor movement, because their argument was we need a strong labor movement because that's how you build a strong working class movement. And so the party, so you got to think of it as sort of three different phases. The first is before the CIO, where the party was the main force in town. In 1934, Alabama experienced a massive strike wave. Textile workers, steel workers, miners, and the Communist Party was behind not so much the textile workers, but the other strikes. They really were building a movement, and they had these alternative unions, maritime workers in Mobile, and so they were building a union movement. And then with the New Deal and with the second New Deal, the opportunity for industrial organizing. This is first New Deal is like the National Industrial Recovery Act, but then with the Wagner Act, there was like a catalyst for really building industrial unions, and that's where the CIO comes into play. And so here, the role of the party was not so much to be open, because this so coincides with the Popular Front, but to go as individual activists, as individual organizers into the unions, and they were the best organizers. Ebb Cox and Henry O. Mayfield and Hosea Hudson. Asbury Howard, who wasn't a communist but very close to the party, was the leader of the International Union of Mine Mills Smelter Workers, along with Van Jones and a bunch of other folks who were like either in or close to the party. And so they built the CIO, but more importantly, and this is very, very important, they pushed for an agenda in which unions were also fighting in communities for voting rights. So the Right to Vote Club was a union, had a union connection. Communists were organizing Right to Vote clubs and were pushing CIO members, Black members in cultural politics to have that right preserved. And all the sort of third period you get is, because the book technically is about the Depression, but it has a long chapter that goes into the 40s and 50s and into the present. And in that chapter, I talk about the left-led unions and how the Cold War and red baiting and anti-communism really were intended as a weapon to undermine, in particular, the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, which is strong in Bessemer. And in that union, its leader, Asbury Howard, was really a kind of civil rights, union, working class, brilliant organizer who then was attacked on all sides through the anti-communist work. In 1949, the CIO, which by that time was really run by anti-communists, forced all the left unions to either sign a loyalty oath and do all kinds of things or be expelled. And Mine Mill was expelled in 1949.
Right. Yeah. You said that, these organizers were really good and the unions were really effective. What were some of the things that they actually won for their members? Well,
and the best examples tend to be the rural areas, but just in terms of the urban and, the most important thing that they were able to do, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, SWOC, and through Mine Mill and United Mine Workers, those three big unions, party organizers, party members were the ones that were able to recruit and win over workers. And that's how the unions were able to survive. And they built the CIO in many ways. But they also fought company unions. And this is something we don't always talk about. I mean, we'll get to this with respect to the Amazon workers, but one of the ways that, just your viewers may or may not know this history, but in those days, because of a strong National Labor Relations Board, and because of the Wagner Act, which made all this possible, the NLRB was actually friendly to unions, which is that's not been the case for a while, but actually supported the idea of unions. And so when Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, for example, would fire 160 workers for going on strike, the NLRB would say, go back to Tennessee Coal and Iron and said, you can't do that. That's illegal. You've got to reinstate them. So one of the things that happens in Alabama and throughout the South and throughout the country is that in order to continue union breaking and to get around the new labor law, you create a company union. Now, company unions are not new, but these company unions are specific to this moment. So
Uber's trying to make some right now.
Yes, they are. And that's one of the questions about what's going to happen to Amazon. But to give you one precise example, the Brotherhood of Captive Miners was a union. It was a company union that was created in response to Mine Mill. And what those communist organizers were able to do was succeed in both forcing union recognition and recruiting members from the Brotherhood of Captive Miners into Mine Mill.
Right.
So they were really good organizers in that respect. They would, and to be an organizer in a union often doesn't mean doing anything necessarily heroic, but really being able to mobilize people and get them to stick with it and to win those elections. And that's what they were able to do, get them to win those elections by basically letting people know through education work what the union is there for.
Right. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.